If you know anything about the early days of college, you know that usually college was only for the elite, people who were expected to become the leaders of their community. In other words, the people who gained a lot of information were the people who ended up with a lot of power. But nowadays, all of us have information at our fingertips, so we all have different types of power. As I've learned more and more about public speaking, I've had to think about the power that I have when it comes to sharing information. In this video, we'll talk about how information is powerful, we'll discuss some of the differences between informative speaking and persuasive speeches, we'll look at ways to prepare and develop your informative speech, and ways to evaluate and assess speeches as well. So first things first, what is information? Your textbook tells you that information is simply knowledge that you gain through either communication, such as the news, or information that you've gained through studying, through research, or instruction. Now, with giving information, there always comes an ethical concern. In fact, when we look back at Aristotle, kind of the person who's considered the father of public communication, this is one of his biggest concerns. How are people who are public speakers being ethical? How are they understanding that the information that they share is not only something that can be used to influence someone, but can be used to shape our entire world? When you think about it, that means that information giving is a huge ethical concern. Now, some of you have had questions about, well, what makes an informative speech different than a persuasive speech? Keep in mind that when you give an informative speech, your number one goal is simply to increase knowledge on your topic. You are giving your audience useful information that they can use to help further their own ideas about your topic. Sometimes, your job is simply to make complex issues less complex. A persuasive speech, on the other hand, the goal is to alter attitudes and behaviors. You want to change people's ideas towards your topic, or make them do a certain thing. Usually in a persuasive speech, you place value on a particular position. You may say, well, this is important, or this is good and that's bad. In an informative speech, you never assign value. You're simply just reporting the facts, and what the audience does with that information is completely up to them. Now, when you give a speech, remember, you need to gain and maintain your audience's attention. We've talked about this before. Your audience is filled with lazy listeners. You, as a speaker, need to generate a need for the information. Why should they listen to you? If you create that need, they'll be more inclined to listen. Create information relevance. This can be done by establishing your listener relevance link. Again, if something is relevant to your audience members, they're more likely to keep paying attention. Sometimes you can provide a fresh perspective. Having them think about something in a new way that they've never ever thought about can be just the thing they need to listen to you even more. Or maybe you want to focus on the unusual. One past student decided to give a speech on a shrimp. Shrimp aren't usually thought of as the most interesting speech topic, but this particular shrimp, the mantis shrimp, has trinocular vision. And because of that trinocular vision, scientists are using that ability to modify our cameras. So maybe that one day we can take a selfie and determine if we have cancer or not. That made this one little shrimp, this one little animal in the ocean, really, really unique and unusual. And yes, the audience definitely paid attention. Another thing to do in your speech is plan for repetition. Now, some repetition is already built in, thanks to your thesis preview, your transitions, and your thesis review. Your audience will hear over and over and over again what your main points are. But remember, repetition helps your audience remember what you're saying. Again, the lazy listener in all of us needs to hear things repeated. If you go all the way back to your childhood, you may remember your mom or your dad or some guardian telling you something over and over and over again. But if I were to ask you, what did they say? You could repeat it back because that repetition made it stick. This is the same thing that you want for your audience members. Another consideration, use advanced organizers. This is simply a statement that warns the listener that significant information is coming. This is where you may say, hey, this is really important, or unless you know this one thing, dot, 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 it kind of signifies that whatever is coming next is really worth listening to. And some of your own professors are guilty of the same practice. They use advanced organizers to help you remember, hey, this is coming up on the test. I need to make sure I write this down. They may say, if you don't listen to anything else that I say today, make sure you get this. And then you write that information down. Again, that is an advanced organizer. Another thing that you can do is use concrete words. These are words that are tangible, like a table. Imagine a table in your head, something that you can touch. But if I were to say, think of the word love, you have images of what love looks like, but not one that's very concrete. Because love is an abstract concept. Whenever you use concrete words, you're helping painting a picture for your audience. You're giving them something that they can use to create that mental image. By creating that mental image, they're more likely to keep listening to you. Another thing that you can do is show contrast. Here's an example of a contrast definition. A person suffering from communication apprehension might also have speech anxiety, but a person with speech anxiety will not necessarily have communication apprehension. If we were to analyze that statement, we realize how those two different ideas, speech anxiety and communication apprehension, are actually quite different from each other. And by emphasizing those differences, we have a clear picture of what the two of them are. Another way that you can identify terms is to use a synonym, something that means the same exact thing, but just said in a different way. So, if you were to use a big word like sagacious, people in your audience may look at you kind of funny. But if you said, hey, be sagacious, be that wise person in the audience, people would realize, oh, sagacious must also mean wise. Or you could use an antonym. Instead of saying, be that wise person in the audience, you could say, well, don't be that silly person in the audience who never listens and doesn't get smarter because of it. In effect, people start realizing, oh, well, sagacious must not mean this, and they still learn in that way. Or you could also use an etymology. An etymology is a form of definition that traces the origin and development of a word. So one etymology that I learned recently was how our word truth is connected to the word tree. And so when I would explain the word truth to people, I would say how it's strongly connected to being rooted and standing firm in your own skin. And this helped them understand truth in a different way. In addition to increasing the understanding of the topic, you need to avoid assumptions. Remember, think about, do my listeners already know this? There may be times where you may need to define or even explain things that you think are common or things that everyone should know. One example of this was when a student was giving a speech. They said, well, I'm assuming that everyone in this room knows about this movie. However, I was actually the one person in the room who hadn't watched the movie before, so I felt a little left out. And since they never explained what happened in the movie, I couldn't really connect to that detail in the same way that other people in the audience connected to. What would have been helpful if that student would have said, hey, do all of my listeners really know this movie? Even just saying, guys, I know most of you have watched that movie before, but I'm going to explain the synopsis anyway, just in case someone doesn't know. By acknowledging that, they would have covered the fact that some people do know and some people don't know, and I wouldn't have felt left out. So remember, never assume the audience does not need that introductory information, what you would consider the basics. Sometimes the basics is exactly what they need. And if you can, personalize your information. Use examples that relate to the audience. Sometimes when I talk about perception, I make sure to think about times when we were all small children and climbed up on countertops. This is a common example that most people had in their childhood, climbing on tall things or hopping on top of mom and dad to see the world the way the big people do. And when I give this example, more people can connect to how perception is different even just by being in a different place. Make sure that you explain any conclusions that you draw up. Don't expect people just to follow your logic. Sometimes you may need to spell it out. Make sure that you reference similarities in people and the audience. So if everyone in the room is from the same state, feel free to make that reference. If you notice that everyone seems to be interested in one particular idea, go ahead, make that reference. And then make sure to reference topics and events that the audience may know. This may be what just happened in the media, what happened politically, or things that most people now may be familiar with. One time when I did not do this successfully was when I talked about 9/11. And then one student raised his hand and said, "Miss Armstrong, I was 2 years old when that happened." Immediately I realized that I was not personalizing my information for everyone in the room, but for just some. So make sure that you know who's in your audience. Now when it comes to evaluating your own informative speech, remember, do you have a strong topic? At this point, you should. We've talked about it. You should feel clear on it. Remember to make sure that you're meeting your general requirements. 4 to 6 minute speech, extemporaneous style. Make sure you're thinking about who's in your audience. Remember to use strong supporting material. Make sure that if you have good, clear research, that you're using it in a way that enhances your speech. Make sure that you organize using the method that I taught you, from attention getter all the way down to clincher. Practice your delivery before giving your speech, making sure that your vocal and your physical are as strong as possible. And even think about your language choice. So how what you're saying is affecting the overall message. So again, when it comes to informative speaking, remember, information has power. We all have information at our fingertips, and your classmates will be looking to you to share that information and to empower them in a new way.